And the last part answered a question for me, which was whether Misbah, I'm also of Pakistani origin, would end up at K2, and it looks like she did. So thank you again to our friends at the Alfred Peace Loan Foundation for their consistent support of this showcase. And it's time to talk about the everyday impacts of climate change. So it's my pleasure to introduce this panel. We'll be talking about some of the sobering news at the very end of that. And I'm going to introduce our moderator, Dr. Logan Brenner, who is an assistant professor of environmental science here at Barnard. So Logan, where are you? Here you go. Thank you so much, Logan.
Oh, okay. I can now unmask. Get everything. Well, it's great to see everyone. I'm super excited to be moderating this panel. We have a really wonderful slate of panelists that are joining us today. So I would like to introduce Jessica Mckenzie, who is an associate editor at the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, where she writes and edits stories about climate change and the environment. And now Victoria Sanders, who is a research analyst at the NYC Environmental Justice Alliance. And very excited to have Holly Morris, who is our filmmaker, author, presenter, and the director of Exposure. Thank you so much for being here. And Gautam Surya, who is a conservation planning scientist in forests and climate change with the Wildlife Conservation Society. Wonderful. Well, we are going to start with some prepared questions with the panel, and then towards the end of the event, we're going to open it up to Q&A with the audience. So please think if you have any questions that you would like to ask any of our panelists. So I'm going to ask a few different types of questions, some, just more about science, some about combining film and science. So I think it would be great to hear, your very varied opinions. So my first question for all of you is, do you think that filmmakers have perhaps a unique responsibility when depicting science on screen?
Well, I'll jump in, although I'm the only non-scientist on the panel here. I guess quite simply that these days, I suppose we do have an obligation to include science, and I guess from a filmmaker's perspective with this film, what I tried to do was make a film that was in part about the climate crisis, but also, as we might use an intersectional film, right? So it's about women's empowerment, it's about the climate crisis, it's just an adventure film, I think. So, and the science part was important to me in that I think a lot of climate films have less effect than they can because they're polemic. And so my idea was to sort of seamlessly integrate the climate issue at Climate Change Ground Zero, the North Pole. So that's from the filmmaking perspective.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm sure you all have watched other movies that include science.
Well, yeah, I think the biggest difference between, I'm a writer, so the biggest difference is that there are all these other tools at your disposal, these visual tools, these audio tools, and filmmaking can be so emotional, and this film is a perfect example of that. But you have to, the obligation is to make sure that you're using that emotion to tell stories that are true and not manipulating the science the wrong way, for example, which if you are doing something about climate change, I would hope you wouldn't do.
I would also say it's a really unique and exciting opportunity to get people invested in something that is so central to all of our lives and our existence on this planet, in a way that we might not otherwise be invested, because I think a lot of people feel really removed from the scientific community. Academia can seem really, hard to attain or to be connected to. And so film is something that we can all connect to so much more easily. And I think it's really powerful. And I think this film was a great example.
Wonderful. Oh, go ahead. Okay. So related to that question, how do you think that film and other similar, probably visual media, can be leveraged to further educate the public about climate change and lead to actual, real, tangible change?
I'd love to hear from one of the scientists about that, because we talk about that all the time. Like, we think how do we move from a story to action?
Mm-hmm.
And is this the kind of film that can do that, or is it a different kind of film? So what do the scientists think about that?
Well, as a journalist, storyteller, climate change can be a really difficult topic to write about. Like, the science can be difficult to explain, or it can be boring, or it can just be really depressing. And films like this do such a good job connecting people with reality. Like, you can talk about how the Arctic sea ice is melting, but unless you see it, you don't really understand what it's like at all. And that is the beauty of that. And then also the ability to go in depth for an hour and a half. The connection that film watcher has to a story can be a lot deeper than, spending 5 to 10 minutes reading an article. It gives you a lot more opportunity to connect and hear from everyday people, not just experts.
I could just expand on that slightly, which is, I think that's a great point, that because the effects of climate change are not going to be as dramatic everywhere as they might be in other places. In a lot of places, the effects of climate change are going to be quite subtle, especially around the Northeast, actually, around the Great Lakes. And so to be able to see places where those effects are much more dramatic, which is something that folk can do, right? Show you things that you wouldn't normally see. That, I think, is really critical. And I think that especially for younger audiences, that could be really useful as well. I think as someone growing up who partly got into wildlife conservation because I watched nature documentaries and saw stuff in the Amazon that I obviously wouldn't see otherwise as a child. Likewise, I think that you can really bring home the dramatic nature of climate change and its impacts in places where otherwise people who are living there may not be seeing those impacts and discerning those impacts in their everyday lives. And that can help lead to action where people might otherwise not really understand the urgency of it.
Yeah, I love that, the combination of these seeing climate change in these distant areas, but with everyday people, I think is really important.
And the character Susan, the scientist, is she became sort of a symbol for the science thread of the story, or at least the mouthpiece for it, I think, in a way. And my hope is that helps people connect to the issues, right? If they're connecting to a human being who they can relate to and maybe be inspired by, that it lands in another way.
So pivoting a little bit away from just film specific, a bit of the elephant in the room, I'm curious how the COVID-19 pandemic has influenced the way you work or you talk about climate change.
I think in my work in advocacy, especially for environmental justice communities, people of color, disadvantaged groups, it really just highlighted all of the disparities that we already knew were there, and really showed how those communities were being left behind by all of these different situations in both COVID with climate change. They're getting hit first and worst. And so it really just highlighted that, and also made all of the work that we were doing more complicated. A lot of what we do is in the community on the ground, and that was taken away during the pandemic. And so it forced us to find new and creative ways to work through that.
I had to step back a little bit from climate and environment reporting. At the time, I was a freelancer, not in my current position. And I had a regular gig writing a newsletter, for example, doing things of concern, public health concerns, and it was all COVID all the time, and climate was really just relegated to the bottom. And I've heard that from a lot of other journalists. It can be hard to continue telling, a slow developing story like this when more immediate disasters are happening.
Yeah, I would say that working for sort of an out-and-out wildlife conservation organization, we sort of had a bit of an advantage of taking a broader view of things in the sense that we weren't really dealing with the immediate human impacts of COVID, for better or worse. But some of the stuff we do deal with, for example, I work on with people in Afghanistan, and one of the things that we've been talking about is as climate change happens, wildlife will move around, and there's potential for wild ungulates, so sheep and goats, to get into contact with livestock populations and for disease spillover to happen and things like that. So in some sense for us, COVID was a way because people have been talking about the theoretical nature of climate change to create pandemics and challenges to human health. And as awful as COVID is, it was at least nice to go like, see, this is a thing, like this is not just theoretical, and the next one could be a lot worse. And so we really need to start thinking about this now and start thinking about this in very specific and particular ways. So being able to have that broader view, I think it was kind of nice to be able to think about this as a long-term problem, to explicitly tie these two things together.
Well, as it COVID relates to this story, I'll just say the last thought you're left with in the film is that this may be the last expedition ever. And in fact, it has been. The year, besides the state of the sea ice, which is deteriorating and their need to cross to the North Pole, the geopolitical conflict and COVID have canceled all expeditions. So the subsequent year was canceled because there was a conflict between Ukraine and Russia. This was 2-3 years ago in terms of airspace and flying. And they need to be on the same page to have made those sort of safety flights happen. And the sea ice was bad. And then COVID canceled it the following 2 years. And then I just found out last week that the 2022 season has been canceled. Obviously because of the Russian airspace situation. So.
Wow, thank you all. Okay, so my next question is about teams in science. So as I think most of us know, science is quite collaborative. It's definitely evident in the movie. But could you speak to how, anyone speak to how diversity strengthens a scientific team in particular? And why is diversity particularly important for the study of climate change?
Well, I will say in my work, it is very abundantly clear how important diversity is. So frequently in our work, we find that the disparities that are experienced by the disadvantaged communities that we work with is because they were never asked to join the table. They were never a part of the discussion, so their experiences were never taken into account. And when you don't have the experiences of a vast group of people, you're going to miss things. You won't even know what you don't know. And that is such a big problem in science. And, you see it in scientific data and all of these things over, decades and centuries of, people being left out. And it causes the data and the information we have to be not as rich as it could be. And that's really a shame. So I love to see diversity in being represented. So,
I mean, I guess to state the obvious, climate change is important, and you want the best people working on it. And given that the best people are well distributed among all possible groups and identities, if you are restricting your search to people who've helped prop up a certain gender, racial status quo, or class status quo, then you're not getting the best people. And I think it's a bit bloody reckless to be playing with the fate of the planet to prop up, those hierarchies and not have the best talent available to you. And more than that, I mean, you could have, I've worked in departments where I was one of the only minorities, and, it's great. Okay, you bring one person in, but if they have to still deal with all the crap and all the microaggressions and bias, this, that, and the other thing, then you're not going to get the best out of them. And again, we're talking about, existential problems here. So having a more diverse team is always going to not just help you get the best talent, but also get the most out of that talent. And again, when what you're trying to do is save the planet, kind of important.
Yeah, and I would just, to build on that, draw from the metaphor of the expedition team, which Felicity, the expedition leader, said at the outset of the film. If you get too many like characters together, it's a disaster, and the team won't work at its best. And so I think that is true for scientific teams. I think it's true for expedition teams. And I think that, you know, this idea of diverse characters from all parts of the world coming together to achieve something very daunting and beating the odds. I mean, hopefully we didn't hit the metaphor too hard, but that's to get to the North Pole, that's what this team had to do. And of course, that's what we are going to have to do as a planet. And I think women's leadership is central to that success. And so that's another kind of subtext going on there.
Yeah, if science is the practice of asking questions, you want to make sure that there are different people asking different questions so that you are not missing things. Yeah.
Yes, certainly. So this question kind of builds off of actually some of the things, Victoria, that you were talking about, and not to put you on the spot again, but you know, some of the impacts of climate change can be less obvious to the public and even to scientists, like you know, how redlining is now intertwined with climate change. And so I was wondering, how you or anyone is able to, or is trying to amplify some of these connections to teach the public and teach other scientists about how to address them.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first important thing is to have diverse voices, like we were talking about, but also making sure that we're amplifying the voices of people from the communities. I think it's really easy to look only to people of authority, people who have a degree, but really you have to talk to people in the neighborhoods who are affected and learn what those issues are. And I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought a little. So amplify those voices and look to the science, because a lot of this is in the data. When you look at the data, you see that environmental justice communities are being affected the worst. You see how stark those numbers are, and so it's easy to say like, oh, like it isn't related to the data, or that's not the point, that's not supported, but it really is. And so yeah, I would say that.
Well, there's a lot of opportunity too to tell untold stories. So if you're a journalist, a storyteller, a filmmaker, you want to be looking at places that have been overlooked, for example, and so you can really find new things in these crises that have been overlooked.
Thank you. So I like to end, before we go into the audience Q&A, I like to end climate discussions with some positivity, right? And a way to feel empowered. So, climate change can feel so overwhelming. We experience climate dread and climate paralysis. And I imagine that you all in your own way encounter some of those difficult feelings in your work. So I was wondering what you do to kind of avoid that constant doom and gloom, and if you have any recommendations for folks who are not in the climate sphere to feel a little bit more empowered about the future.
Anyone have good suggestions? I could use them.
I was banking on you guys for the positivity. Go ahead.
I'll say it's hard. It's difficult work. It's sometimes really sad work, but you have to look to the victories and celebrate them when they come. I think it can be easy to be like, oh, well, that was a small victory. We have to just keep working, and you do, but you also have to stop and appreciate that moment and appreciate all the progress that has been made, because so much progress truly has been made. It's just there's a lot more work to do still.
This is something I've been grappling with. I've only been in my new full-time job as a climate change editor for about 5 months now. And so before I was doing a wider range of stories. So to go all in on climate all the time, I'm still new to this. It's something I found overwhelming. I do not have any good tips, but my New Year's resolution was taking 30 minutes outside each day and sort of just like appreciating nature. I think, people who are involved in climate and environment science, storytelling, like nature and like being outside. And I think it's important just to stay grounded in the world around you, because the answers and happiness and peace are not in your computer screen. And that's not where you're going to be able to relax and take a moment to appreciate the outdoors, the climate we still have.
Well, I just try to support and tell stories of positive stories of usually through the words of unlikely heroines who end up on top one way or another, despite the last film I did was called The Babushkas of Chernobyl, and they had some pretty grim climate odds or, environmental devastation surrounding them, but it was ultimately an affirming story. And so I hope that people can draw a way forward from some of these stories.
I'll just put in one other thing, which is, so I mean, not you, everyone probably knows this, but when you think about climate change responses, there are really two ways of thinking about it. There's mitigation and there's adaptation. And a lot of the doom and gloom stories come from the mitigation side, because right now, most IPCC and other panels conclude that like a lot of our mitigation at this point, that there's not a ton we can do. I actually focus a lot on adaptation. And so to the extent that I have a lot of positive stories, that's the direction it comes from. I mean, mitigation is still important. And I think that there is that problem of, with a lot of the stories coming out, they're not well framed. It's, we're a little bit too late to do sort of the most mitigation, but we can still do some. But we now know that adaptation has to happen. And I think that successful stories about adaptation are where you can bring the most of the positivity. That is to say that, we're not going to the sort of pre-industrial temperature baseline. That's not happening. But we can and will and have to successfully adapt to the changed baselines. And there are places where that is happening and, successfully happening. And I think a lot of those stories of like, yes, we've shifted our baseline a little bit, but we can still survive. Animals can still survive. Stories of, evolutionary adaptation in wildlife populations where we didn't think it might happen, things like that. That's where you get a lot of positivity from. And so I think that sort of climate adaptation thinking that we're trying to push more in the conservation sphere rather than just trying to return to the old baseline, which is where a lot of the doom and gloom comes from. I think that can be really helpful.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And I mean, I too think about climate, and I like to combine some of those like small personal actions, which a lot of people often like cross up as saying they don't make a difference, but it's giving me a way to like buoy myself to tackle some of those larger issues. And so I think a combination of both is important. But thank you all. That's, I think, all wonderful tips and advice. But with that, we'd love to hear any questions from the audience. So you can come up. It looks like we have one mic over here to ask your question.
Hi, I was curious to hear from each one of you on the panel. What are the things that you think ordinary people can do that are most helpful and most effective in terms of climate change action?
I think the answer I've heard from other people I trust the most is to get involved in organizing, activism. As a journalist, I don't do that so much because I'm reporting on their work, and my personal actions are I'm mostly vegetarian and I don't own a car, public transportation. I think there are small lifestyle changes you can make, but the most impactful thing is to not work as an individual, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little tricky because the true crux of the problem with climate change is not on the individual level, right? So it can be hard to feel like, oh, like if I go vegetarian, that will help, but it will. But like she mentioned, organizing is a good method. And so at my organization, the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, we're involved in all sorts of coalitions. And one that you can follow is New York Renews. You can go to their website and you can go join their mailing list, and they'll give you more information about the movement and the actions that they're taking and ways that you can get involved personally. Right now, they're working on trying to get some more funding in the state budget for the work that they're doing. So definitely check that out.
As we roll out this film, we're teaming up with lots of community organizations like Justice Outside and other organizations who believe in this value of simply being outside and that connecting the personal to sort of larger political action. So yeah, and there's more and more of them.
The only thing I would also just add is because the impacts of climate change, like I said, are pretty different depending on where you are. Like hot and dry is generally true on average, but not true everywhere. Is just trying to learn a little bit more about these specific climate impacts in the places where you are, and thinking about, again, adaptation measures for how your community and you yourself might be able to face those particular challenges. For example, out here, like snow amounts are almost certainly going to increase. And so thinking about that and thinking about how your communities might need to deal with that down the road and planning around that, or, places where freshwater availability may decrease, and thinking about how to make water use more sustainable starting today and not, 40 years from now. Those are all kind of useful things to do, thinking locally about the problem.
And perhaps it goes without saying, but I'll say it, vote, and, vote for people who have bold, evidence-based policies.
I think this film really is uplifting and will move people in the right direction. But it seems to me that I'm very curious about how the whole thing got started, that it should be, women from various places and various ethnicities and religions. I mean, and not particularly professional in the field. It seems so highly unlikely, and the wonderful success.
Unlikely was probably the most operational word from the beginning of this whole thing. But the vision for the expedition was all Felicity Aston, the expedition leader. She had this, as a European, she had this idea to bring together the women from Europe and the Arab world. And I mean, her, she once said to me, it's not really in the film, but look, she's a polar explorer. She is someone who had been to the South Pole and done a lot of polar exploration. And she said, I'm an adventurer. This is my way of doing something, right? Around climate change and women's empowerment and things like this. So, but it was all her vision. And then the project came about because the values that were part of this expedition were part of my wheelhouse. And so when I heard her global call for applications in 2016, I started tracking her in the project, and many things happened, but over the course of 5 years, we got the film made. So that's the short story.
I'm curious if any of you can provide me with some examples or a source where I can go find examples of where the data and the published research is flawed because underrepresented communities were not involved in the research.
Well, I can give you an example of a report that my organization did that showed the discrepancy between government research and our own. So we had an air quality monitoring project that we did called Camp EJ, Community Air Monitoring Project for Environmental Justice. And we found in that, basically we had community members walk around their neighborhoods with air monitoring devices to do hyperlocal air quality monitoring, and found that in some of the neighborhoods, the amount of pollution in the air was up to 20 times higher than what the city and state were reporting, because the methods they're using are insufficient to show what's actually happening on the ground. So that's one example.
Thank you.
Hi, so I thought this was such an interesting story of what women's leadership can look like. And for the director, a question for you is, did anything surprise you about how the story of women's leadership unfolded while you were filming this?
Yeah, I mean, there were surprises around every corner. It was a difficult production. And I guess I have to say, and I probably shouldn't admit this, but I was surprised, and I think everyone was surprised that they made it to the North Pole. I mean, I think part of the story, some of which is on the film, is that they were counted out, and there was a pretty macho community of explorers up there, and the odds were against them in lots of ways. But because I watched them physically over time and trained with them, I personally thought between the state of the sea ice, which was pretty grim, and the fact that they were regular people, they were not even athletes, much less polar explorers, most of them, almost all of them. And so, yeah, I mean, I was thrilled and surprised that they made it to the North Pole in a way. And in the end, I think that's, every sort of expedition film, you want your top of the mountain moment and all of that. But I think this one, even though ironically there was no top of anything, but except the world, but it was really profound because I thought it was pretty unexpected.
I had a quick question about adaptation. I'm just wondering, I feel like a lot of the examples of adaptation that I've seen are like very much linked to like entrepreneurship and business and capitalism. And I'm wondering if there are examples of anti-capitalist adaptation, because in my opinion, that's the way to go, because a lot of climate change is driven by capitalism. So like, what are some examples of adaptation that isn't just like Teslas, I guess?
Yeah, so I'm thinking a lot more lo-fi, as it were. So simple example, again, working in Northeast Afghanistan, we're looking at places where snow leopards might move in. And so it's as simple as like, get them some dogs instead of shooting the snow leopards, building livestock corrals, doing health monitoring, which is a sort of fundamentally government driven and not private driven in a lot of these places, because there's no profit to be made from, swabbing the nostrils of a sheep every couple weeks or what have you. So a lot of the local sort of initiatives, when you, as you say, as you move away from the sort of the splashy Teslas of the world, a lot of the sort of local scale climate initiatives tend to be, I don't know that I would specifically categorize them as anti-capitalist, but I certainly wouldn't categorize them as private sector driven. Does that sort of make sense?
More than one of you have said that being outdoors, appreciating nature, makes you want to do something about it. But also, I'm not within the last 2 or 3 years, but I was looking for data myself that would prove this, because as you say, it's in the data, it must be there, but I didn't find it. So how do we go about proving it? Because so many of the programs that we have, like for children being outdoors, and they're premised on this, but if they're really challenged, you can't prove it.
I think there are some recent studies out now that do prove that, and I would have a look at the Redford Center Redford Center, which was one of this film's funders and produced in association with the Redford Center, but they support environmental films, many environmental films across the board, and their whole campaign right now is using film to basically get kids in the next generation outdoor. And they have if you looked at their website, you could get some details about what current studies there are that are proving just what you mentioned, and you guys might know that.
Yeah, I'm less familiar with studies about spending time outside, getting people more active in environmentalism or climate work, but I do know that there's plenty of studies showing the health and stress, like de-stressing benefits of being outside. And I don't think you can do this work without being healthy. Like, you have to take care of yourself before you take care of the world. And I think that has been well established. Looking outside, spending time in greenery, spending time immersed in nature. There's lots of evidence that of the benefits to the individual that I think can only expand out to the societal level if everyone had those.
I'll quickly just add, as a good employee of WCS, that informal education things like zoos and aquaria we do a lot of research on like attitudes of visitors and how those change when you come to the zoo and you see animals and things like that. And there's an increasing body of evidence that those sort of informal education venues can make pretty lasting differences on people's attitudes as well.
Hi, thank you so much for this really important discussion. My main question is for Holly. This movie was so harrowing. I loved it. And I really appreciated what you said about avoiding making the film a polemic. And I'm wondering when in the storytelling process you realized that was an issue. And I mean, I'm also in the breadth of your career, I suppose. So I'm just curious, like, how you went about that.
Well, in terms of the breadth of my career, I started out in book publishing. I was at a feminist book publishing company called Steel Press for many years through my 20s, and published a lot of great books. But I did feel like we lost our audience sometimes, right? And now it's many years later, and I think a lot of what we were doing then is more mainstream. But so when I went into film and TV, part of my specific idea was to take some of these ideas from my, radical feminist publishing to the mainstream, this medium with huge impact. And so I always felt to do that. I don't know. I just sort of am drawn to an artful telling of a story, and I think ultimately it might have more power if you can weave in all the values that you want while not lecturing anybody. So in the Babushkas of Chernobyl, which was my last feature before this one, it's, as you can imagine, it could be an anti-nuke film. It could be a lot of things, but it's, and that's the background: environmental collapse, environmental devastation, just like that's the background of this. But so I guess I just, I'm sort of circling around. I guess I just feel like it's more interesting. It's a creative challenge. And I think ultimately, if you can succeed, which I never quite feel like I do, but I feel like it's worth keep trying, that you can ultimately make something that stands the test of time more. And maybe, and if you impact people emotionally, you're more likely to, I don't know. It can be more profound, and perhaps even action-oriented impact. But we'll see. I mean, this film is just out. I don't know how it will land in the world.
I'm super interested in, Felicity said she had 1,000 applicants and she picked this team, which I was really shocked and amazed how well they all got to work together in these extreme environments. Can you tell us more, Holly, about what her selection process was like? There was like a little teeny quote on it in the film, and that's it. And she did a fabulous job picking people, and I'm curious.
Yeah, she put out this global call for applications. She got thousands of people who applied, and then she had some pretty specific ideas. Like, she wasn't interested in Americans, for example. She had, regional, and, what are you going to do? You have 11 people. You can't have someone from every country. But, she had a vision. But really what it came down to, I think, for her, having talked to her, is like sort of their strength of character in a way, not their physical strength or their experience. But more like if she thought they could go the distance. It's an emotional challenge as much as physical, this expedition. And it took years, and they had to be very committed. And I will tell you that 2 people dropped out. They aren't in the film, but like 2 people on the, glaciers in Iceland just was like, couldn't do it for whatever reason, decided it wasn't for them. Yeah. Yeah. Zoom. Well, yeah. I think that's the strength of a great leader, to be able to spend time talking to people and suss out some of those characteristics. And I mean, I don't think she had a specific like set of questions people had to answer right. I think it was just trying to get to know, look people in the eye and get a sense of what they would be like. And also, as we referenced earlier, put together a team that the full picture put together a whole puzzle, right? It wasn't that she was looking for, there were a lot of people who climbed Everest, a lot of women who've done that she could have put a team together like that, but she thought that was first, it would be a disaster. And I think she has been on a lot of expeditions before. And I think you do learn, as a leader of expeditions, you learn to sort of, I don't want to say judge, but you kind of, you can get a sense of someone's character. I won't say there wasn't bumps, there were bumps. And of course, any expedition has that, but they overcame them. And lots of expeditions fall apart because they don't. You run, as she says, somebody somebody on the team is not valued or dismissed or something like that, and that's where the real problems start. It's not because someone can't put up a tent fast enough. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but that's as good as she told me. Yes. Sorry.
I think we're about at
Sorry.
we're about at time. So I think we have to wrap it up now. But that was a really wonderful question to end on. But I just wanted to say thank you again to you, Holly, and all of our panelists for this really wonderful conversation and the questions from all of you.
Thank you, and thank Athena.
Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of the day.